Famicom Detective Club The Girl Who Stands Behind is the second game in the Detective Club series, but also a prequel and I guess origin story for the Detective Club itself. Now in today's review I'm not going to go into detail into the release of this game, as I already did that in the last Detective Club review, which I think you should watch before this one, but the important information is here. This is a remake of an original Japanese only Nintendo game that was now released in conjunction with The Missing Heir for the first time in the West on the Switch. So let's start with the actual review then. Beginning with the story, The Girl Who Stands Behind, like I already mentioned, is a sort of origin story for our characters, as we see how our main character, who you get to name for some reason, got to be a detective and solve his first case, and how he met some of the other recurring characters of this series. It's odd to me, maybe they expected to just make more games for this series, or maybe not, but it feels really weird to me that we got a sort of ending with The Missing Heir in the way that it gave closure to our main character, and a beginning with The Girl Who Stands Behind, but we never got much of the middle adventures. Maybe this was a writer's choice, as maybe just didn't want to write a straightforward murder mystery and wanted to have something that was more personal to the characters. But that's just me theorizing. So what's the mystery this time around? Well, here the investigation starts as the body of a schoolgirl is found in a river, and as you investigate it becomes obvious that there was some sort of foul play. The investigation then leads you to her school, which is where a majority of the story takes place, as an old case and the creepy school rumor might be connected to it all. And these two aspects really become the driving force for the plot as you slowly discover how all of it connects. There's just more going on than in The Missing Heir, and I think overall I just ended up enjoying this one more. And much like Missing Heir, there's still a very impressive level of it being grounded in reality that adds to the story, making it a lot more believable in a way. And in some ways it actually makes it more interesting than maybe more out there murder mysteries. But I think a big part of it was also the pacing. In my previous review I mentioned the pacing was a bit messy because of how the gameplay works, but I think that not only does this game handle some bits a little bit better, but I also think that a big part of it was just me getting used to it, as I played this game almost back to back with the previous game, and I just knew that I had to try out the same options again and again when hitting a wall, because it might just trigger something. That being said, as you can see, my original problem with it feeling like you're stumbling through the dark is still here when the game wants you to do those very specific sequence of choices. Final thing to mention about the story though, that slightly relates to the gameplay, is the relationship with Ayumi. This is a character that was in Missing Heir, but in that game she was fairly inconsequential as a character, while here she's much more important, being directly related to the ongoing plot. And the thing to mention here is that at the end of the game you'll get a relationship rating made out of hearts, and if you max it out you get a post-credit scene. To do this you have to basically only pick the nice options and nothing that could be construed as bad, which I didn't do because I pretty much asked every character about everything, because you know, that's what a detective should do. And the game really emphasizes that as well with how it works. So it's kind of weird that this feature even exists. And fair to say I didn't get this scene and had to look it up after on YouTube. And honestly it's kind of weird. It's like there is never any actual romantic angle between these characters aside from a couple throwaway scenes. And it's not like this secret cutscene is romantic either. It's very restrained, which might be a reflection of the 80s Japan when this game was originally released, but maybe, I have no idea, so don't take that too seriously. One more thing to say about this character though, I swear actual final thing about the story is one scene that got censored here in the West, and that was the scene where you can perv on Ayumi. This is another scene I didn't get during my gameplay, but apparently in a specific scene if you examine Ayumi a bunch of times you'll be called a pervert, and you get a fake ending where you lose your job and it just ends there. And in the English version Visually, it's exactly the same, except you get called out for not killing a bee next to Ayumi, which for reference, this bee does not exist. The only changes made here were in the text, and so you unlock a scene where you lose your job because you didn't kill a random bee flying by. It's a very weird censor. My guess is that the original really come off as harassment in the text, which makes sense why you would want to censor that. Also, it does also feel somewhat out of place with this story, but I'm not 100% sure. But that's my guess, since the visuals don't show anything remotely sexual or otherwise, and again, they didn't change anything visually in the English version either. Regardless though, not something super important, so let's move on to the gameplay. Much like in the other game, you have 5 main options. Call/engaging, for calling and changing between people you are talking to. Then of course we have talk, which allows you to talk and ask questions. Then look/examine, which allows you to do exactly what it says on the tin. Remember, which is used a little bit more in this game, but still not the most useful option. This allows your character to reflect on the information he has been given. And of course, quit investigation, which allows you to save and quit. And much like the missing air, there are also other more context specific ones that will show up throughout the story, like grab, open, or speculate, which is one that appears at the end of each chapter and basically goes through all the information you got until that point in a concise form. And of course, sometimes these options can all be used in different ways than they originally were intended to trigger some sort of event that pushes the story forward. To give a different example from last time, here you can, in a very specific situation, use look/examine to stare at someone and have them react to that, triggering them to say something that they wouldn't have said before. It's pretty identical to the other Detective Club game. The major difference I found is how in this game events trigger a lot more often just from picking a choice. An example would be asking someone something, and then when you go to click to talk, it just immediately triggers the next conversation instead of having you have to pick the topic. This does help the pacing a lot, as sometimes, like I have mentioned before in my previous review, it can be awkward not knowing what to talk about to progress the game, and as you make the wrong choices, it does end up breaking up the pacing of the game in a negative way, and this kinda remedies that a little bit. But that's also pretty much it. It's honestly such a mild difference that it shouldn't even take into consideration when deciding what game you would play first in the series. Everything is borderline the same, even the skip button thankfully is still there and still quick as ever, as it's seriously a very quick and to an extent dangerous skip button, because you could just skip a big chunk of the story on accident. Maybe it's not even that fast, it just feels fast, I don't know. Overall though, it does feel better pacing wise, but I just don't know how much of that is just because when I went to play this game I was just a lot more used to its shenanigans, having have played the previous one before it. Moving on then to the graphics, it looks good. It's an anime game, but it's a grounded one, taking place in a world much like our own, and it manages to do this without feeling bland. Characters are still very well detailed and their designs do often reflect their personalities, and the backgrounds are arguably even more detailed than them, and overall it's just a good and solid looking game. Soundtrack wise then, it's also good and maybe equally impressive from a remaster standpoint, as they took the original music from the Famicom that has an 8-bit sound and made it instrumental, which, you know, there is good 8-bit music. This isn't trying to dispute that, but it's clear to me that this game's story and look favor that instrumental soundtrack a lot more, and it's just a good soundtrack overall. And something I actually failed to mention in my Missing Air review was that from the menu you can just go and listen to the music, and not only that but also listen to the original versions of it, which is pretty cool. I know this isn't the first game to do it, but I think it's a thing that remakes should do if they can. To finish this off then, I ended up enjoying The Girl Who Stands Behind quite a bit more than The Missing Heir. It just felt a bit more interesting plot-wise, and as for the ending, it felt a bit better as well. And for those reasons, I'm giving Famicom Detective Club The Girl Who Stands Behind a 7 out of 10. Yes, this nudged it for me, given I gave Missing Heir a 6, but I did say that it was very close to a 7, and this just pushed it there. And I would say that my review for the two games together would also be a 7, honestly. Now going into the recommendations, where I finally can give a bit more of an in-depth opinion, and honestly, if you only decide to play one, then you should try this one. I still think that the price for them individually and in a bundle, it's still steep, and it's still absolutely mind-boggling to me that if you live in Europe you can't buy them separately. But whatever, my recommendation is price-wise, wait for a sale. $35 for a fairly short visual novel at around 7 hours is really not worth it in my opinion. Even if this was an amazing game. Not even with the bundle discount for both, I still think it's not a good value. Now something to address here though is of course The Girl Who Stands Behind. Came out after, but it's also a prequel. Now I think story wise playing either one first is fine, it won't ruin the other one. Yeah, you have amnesia in The Missing Heir, but this game doesn't give you any information about the characters that you wouldn't immediately get at the beginning of The Missing Heir, so I think it's fine. But regardless, it's up to you to decide at the end of the day, and regardless of what your decision is, I hope that you enjoyed watching, and if so, please consider subscribing and liking and even commenting, all things you can do for free here on YouTube, and regardless of that, I hope you're having a good day, and goodbye.